I don't love him. Once I steal enough money from him to buy a dream house for myself and my ex, I'll dump him. Those weren't the careless words of a stranger. They were whispered by Rosemary Blake, the wife Joe trusted with his soul. But what she didn't know was that her husband had already begun weaving a trap so sharp and silent, it would crush her entire scheme in front of the world. Now let me ask you, if you overheard the person you trusted most in this world, the one you shared a bed with every night, plotting to rob you blind and then throw your love away like trash, what would you do? Would you storm in, demand answers, and risk losing everything in one explosive night? Or would you swallow the betrayal, play the long game, and wait for the perfect moment to strike back? Joe's heart pounded against his ribs as though it wanted to burst out of his chest and scream. Every muscle in his body screamed for him to charge into the room and confront Rosemary, his wife of 8 years, the woman he thought was his partner in every dream and storm. But something stronger than anger held him back, a cold, sharp instinct. He knew he had just stumbled into the kind of secret that could ruin a man's life in a single breath, or if handled carefully, could turn into the greatest revenge story ever lived. Inside the living room, Rosemary's voice was syrupy, sweet in a way Joe hadn't heard directed at him in years. "Yes, baby. He believes every word I tell him," she cooed into the phone. "He's got money tucked away from some new contract at work. Once I get the details, we can finally buy our house. Just imagine it, me and you together forever." Her laughter cut through him like broken glass. Joe gripped the doorframe, fighting the heat rising in his chest. He felt betrayed, humiliated, played for a fool. But beneath all that pain, something inside him clicked. A new resolve. He wasn't going to let her know he had heard a thing. That night, Joe entered the house as though nothing had happened. He smiled, he kissed her cheek, he asked about dinner. And when Rosemary looked at him with those practiced eyes of hers, she didn't see the storm brewing beneath his calm exterior. But Joe wasn't going to confront her. He was going to watch. He was going to play along. And he was going to set the trap of a lifetime. Because if there was one thing Rosemary had underestimated, it was who she was dealing with. The days that followed were strange, almost surreal. To Rosemary, everything looked normal. Her husband still left early for work, still called her during lunch breaks, still brought home small surprises, her favorite coffee, a book she once mentioned in passing. But behind Joe's calm smile was a man taking notes, building a silent case, and waiting for his wife to slip deeper into her own greed. He remembered her words on the phone like they were carved into stone. "Once I steal enough money from him, I'll dump him." Every laugh she faked, every sudden sweetness, every "honey, how was your day?" replayed in his mind, sharper than broken glass. At night, while she scrolled endlessly on her phone beside him, Joe would stare at the ceiling. He thought about the years he'd given her, the long hours at work, the savings he'd built, the vacations he canceled so she could chase her dreams. And now? She wanted to use all that to run away with another man. But Joe wasn't a fool. Not anymore. He decided to lean into her plan. He gave her more rope than she could resist. Over dinner one evening, he casually mentioned a new contract at work that would pay 6 figures up front. He watched her eyes widen for just a second before she forced a smile. "That's amazing, Joe," she said, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. Her voice was sweet, but her grip was tight, too tight, as though she was already holding on to the future she imagined. Joe nodded, hiding the anger boiling inside. "Yeah, I think it could really change things for us." She tilted her head, pretending to be curious. "So, where will you put the money? Straight into savings?" He smiled as though nothing was amiss. "Yeah, something like that." Inside, Joe was already planning. A new account, one that Rosemary would believe held his fortune. A decoy, a trap. And the best part? He knew she couldn't resist trying to get her hands on it. Meanwhile, when Rosemary thought Joe wasn't watching, she grew careless. Joe noticed the hushed phone calls that ended abruptly when he walked into the room, the way she lingered in front of her laptop screen, typing furiously, then minimizing windows. She thought she was clever. She thought she was in control. But Joe had already decided. He wasn't just going to expose her betrayal. He was going to make sure she could never hurt him, or any other man, again. As he lay beside her one night, listening to her soft breathing, Joe whispered to himself, too low for her to hear. "You think you're playing me, Rosemary, but this game is mine." And so the mask stayed on, a loving husband by day, a patient hunter by night. The stage for betrayal had been set. Joe wasn't the kind of man who rushed into things. His life had taught him patience. Contracts, business deals, investments. He knew that timing could make or break everything. Now, that same patience would be his greatest weapon against Rosemary. The first step was subtle. He opened a new account under his name. On the surface, it looked like a regular savings account, but in truth, it was designed with one purpose: to bait Rosemary. Every detail was carefully staged. He accidentally left statements where she could find them. He dropped casual hints about transferring large amounts into it from his recent contracts. When she asked questions, he gave vague answers, knowing curiosity would gnaw at her like a hungry dog. But Joe didn't stop there. He had friends in places Rosemary never imagined. One of them was Martin, a longtime attorney who had seen enough ugly divorces and fraudulent schemes to know every dirty trick in the book. Joe met him in a quiet cafe one evening, his face calm, but his voice low and sharp. "I need everything airtight," Joe said, sliding a folder across the table. "Bank statements, transfers, everything. I want it documented so no one can question what really happened when the time comes." Martin scanned the papers, then looked at Joe. "You're setting a trap." Joe didn't deny it. "I'm giving her enough rope to hang herself. I want no loopholes, no misunderstandings. When she makes her move, I want the law already waiting at the door." Martin leaned back, impressed. "You've thought this through." Most men would have exploded the second they heard those words. Joe's eyes darkened. "Most men don't know what it's like to give everything and be betrayed. She took my loyalty and turned it into a weapon. Now I'm turning her greed into her prison." The next step was law enforcement. Joe wasn't reckless enough to handle this alone. Through Martin's connections, he quietly contacted detectives who specialized in financial crimes. They were skeptical at first. After all, betrayal between spouses wasn't exactly rare. But once they saw the evidence Joe had collected so far, their interest sharpened. "Keep feeding her the information," one detective advised. "The moment she tries to move that money, we'll have everything we need." So Joe went home, calm and collected, wearing his mask of a faithful husband. Rosemary never suspected a thing. She believed she was 2 steps ahead, whispering to her ex on late-night calls, plotting their escape, even sketching out plans for their dream house on napkins she hid in her purse. But every call, every message, every suspicious move was quietly recorded, traced, and stored. Joe wasn't just watching. He was building a case so strong it would crush her illusions in one single night. The paper trap was set. Now, all that remained was for Rosemary to take the bait. And Joe knew she would. It started small. Rosemary began asking questions that seemed innocent on the surface. One night, as they sat together on the couch, she leaned against Joe's shoulder, her voice soft. "So, this big contract you mentioned, did it finally pay out?" Joe smiled at the television, pretending to be half distracted. "Some of it, not all yet. But the company wired in advance, enough to make a difference." Her eyes flickered, just for a second, with the kind of hunger he had once mistaken for love. She tucked her hair behind her ear and tried to sound casual. "That's good. You work so hard, Joe. You deserve it." Joe almost laughed at the performance. Deserve it? She wasn't even hiding it well anymore. A few days later, he left an envelope on the desk in his home office, deliberately unsealed. Inside were fake transfer documents Martin had helped him draft, showing deposits that looked enormous. When Joe returned that evening, the envelope had been moved. Rosemary denied touching it, of course, but her eyes darted too quickly when she said it. The trap was working. Soon Rosemary grew bolder. She began pushing for details about passwords, asking little questions that she thought were clever. "Oh, honey, you always forget things," she joked one night. "Maybe I should help you keep track of your logins. You know, just in case something happens to you." Joe chuckled, shaking his head. "I've got it all handled." But inside he noted every word, every slip of her mask. By now she was calling her ex more frequently. Joe overheard snippets when she thought he was in the shower. "It's close, I swear," she whispered one night. "He's loaded. We'll have the money soon. Just be patient." Joe's blood boiled, but his face never showed it. He knew one misstep could ruin everything. So instead of rage, he gave her more to chew on. At dinner, he sighed dramatically. "I've been moving funds around. It's exhausting. One mistake and everything crashes. You wouldn't believe how much money is sitting in that account right now." Rosemary's fork clattered against her plate. "Oh? How much?" He smiled lazily. "Enough to buy 2 houses if I wanted, but it's better if I don't talk numbers." She laughed, pretending to brush it off, but her mind was already working overtime. Joe could see it in the way she stayed up later at night, fingers flying across her phone screen, whispering into the dark. One evening, when she thought he was asleep, Joe heard her whisper, "He'll never see it coming. Once I get it, we're gone." Joe closed his eyes, steadying his breathing, hiding the smirk tugging at his lips. Because the truth was, she was right about one thing. She would never see it coming. The rain tapped against the windows that evening, a steady rhythm that masked the storm brewing inside Joe's house. Rosemary sat at the dining table, her laptop open, her face glowing in the light of the screen. She thought Joe had gone upstairs to shower, but he was standing in the hallway silently watching. Her fingers moved quickly. She had memorized his forgotten password weeks ago, copied from a note he'd left on the desk. Deliberately, of course. She clicked into the bank portal, her breath shallow with excitement. Joe's fake account appeared on the screen. The numbers glared back at her. Hundreds of thousands, more than she had ever seen in one place. She covered her mouth, her eyes wide. She whispered into her phone, her voice trembling with thrill. "It's real. The money's there. I told you. By tomorrow we'll have everything we need for the house." Joe's jaw clenched, but he stayed hidden. He had already tipped off the detectives earlier that day. They were ready, waiting. All he needed was for her to take that final step. Rosemary typed quickly, initiating the transfer. Her hands shook so badly she had to stop twice to steady herself. She thought she was moments away from her dream life. She didn't know she was seconds away from her downfall. The moment she hit submit, Joe stepped into the room. His voice was calm, steady, but cold enough to freeze the air. "Big night, isn't it, Rosemary?" She spun around, her face pale, her lips trembling. "Joe, I can explain." But before she could finish, red and blue lights flashed outside. Doors slammed. Heavy footsteps thundered up the porch. In seconds, police officers burst into the house surrounding her. "Rosemary Blake," one officer barked. "You're under arrest for attempted fraud and conspiracy to commit theft." She collapsed against the chair, shaking her head wildly. "No, this isn't what it looks like. Joe, tell them. Tell them I didn't mean it." Joe's eyes locked on hers. There was no pity, no softness left. "You meant every word," he said quietly. "I heard you, every call, every plan, and tonight you showed me who you really are." Rosemary screamed as the handcuffs clicked around her wrists. Neighbors gathered outside, whispering, pointing, filming on their phones. The woman who once strutted with pride was now dragged past them in disgrace. Her dream had just crumbled into dust, and Joe hadn't lifted a finger. He had only let her destroy herself. The echo of the handcuffs still rang in Rosemary's ears as the patrol car pulled away from the house. Rain streaked down the windows, blurring the sight of neighbors who stood outside, recording her humiliation on their phones. Just hours earlier, she had imagined herself unlocking the door of a dream house with her ex by her side. Now the only door in her future was made of steel bars. At the station, detectives laid the evidence on the table. Printed call logs, text messages, bank transfer attempts, all neatly tied together. Rosemary's face drained of color as she flipped through them. Every move she thought was clever had been documented, every whisper preserved. "You don't understand," she stammered, her voice cracking. "It wasn't supposed to go this far, I thought—" One detective cut her off sharply. "You thought you could rob your husband blind and walk away, but he was 10 steps ahead of you." Meanwhile, her ex, the man she had built her fantasies around, was nowhere to be found. The same night she was arrested, he vanished, his phone switched off, his apartment abandoned. He had cut her loose without hesitation, leaving her to face the consequences alone. Sitting in the interrogation room, Rosemary realized the bitter truth. She wasn't the mastermind. She was just a pawn. Back at home, Joe stood in silence as the flashing lights faded from the street. For the first time in weeks, the house felt still, empty but peaceful. He poured himself a glass of water, staring at his reflection in the darkened kitchen window. Part of him felt hollow, as if years of love and trust had been ripped from his chest. But another part, the stronger part, felt liberated. The calls from neighbors began almost immediately. Friends, colleagues, even distant relatives reached out, asking what had happened. Joe gave them all the same calm answer. The truth finally came out. He didn't rage. He didn't curse her name. He didn't need to. Rosemary had written her own ending. In her cell, Rosemary lay awake, replaying her own words in her head. "I don't love him. Once I steal enough money." Now those words were chains around her wrists. Her ex had promised her freedom, adventure, and a new life. Instead, he had abandoned her the second trouble arrived. She realized too late that the man she betrayed had been the only one who ever truly stood by her. But Joe was done. The marriage was over, and soon, everyone would know exactly why. 2 weeks after the arrest, the courtroom was packed. The air was thick with whispers as though the entire city had gathered to watch the downfall of Rosemary Blake. Joe sat at the front, his posture straight, his expression calm. He wasn't here for vengeance. He was here for closure. When the judge asked him to speak, Joe rose slowly, his voice steady. "Your Honor, I gave my wife 8 years of my life. I trusted her with everything I had, my home, my heart, my dreams. She repaid that trust with deceit. Tonight, I'm not asking for punishment. I'm asking for freedom." The room was silent. Rosemary, dressed in a prison uniform, sat hunched beside her lawyer, her once proud demeanor shattered. She avoided Joe's eyes, ashamed to meet the man she had tried to destroy. Joe handed over the divorce papers. Every detail was in order. The financial evidence, the betrayal, the conspiracy, all laid bare. The judge didn't hesitate. "Divorce granted." A collective gasp swept the room. Joe exhaled, a weight lifting from his chest. For the first time in years, he felt unchained. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed him with questions. "Joe, what will you do now? How does it feel to see her arrested? To see the marriage end this way?" Joe paused, his gaze steady. "It feels like waking up. Sometimes the person you trust most hides the deepest knife. But betrayal doesn't break you. It teaches you. And from that lesson you rise stronger." His words spread quickly, turning him into a symbol of resilience. Colleagues shook his hand, strangers offered encouragement, and neighbors who once envied Rosemary's charm now pitied her fall. Meanwhile, in her cell, Rosemary spiraled. Her ex hadn't written, he hadn't visited, He had disappeared as if she never existed. The dream house she had once clung to now mocked her in her mind. 4 empty walls she would never see. She replayed Joe's words in court, words filled not with hatred, but with strength, and that cut deeper than anger ever could. For Joe, life began anew. He poured his energy into work, into rebuilding himself, into living with dignity. At night, the silence in the house was no longer heavy. It was peaceful, filled with the promise of freedom. One evening, as he stood on the balcony overlooking the city, he whispered the words he wished Rosemary had understood. When greed blinds the heart, betrayal will chain the hands. Freedom felt different than Joe had imagined. It wasn't loud or triumphant. It was quiet, steady, like breathing clean air after years in a smoke-filled room. He threw himself into his work, not out of escape but out of passion. The betrayal had stripped him of illusions, but it had also sharpened him. Deals he once second-guessed now came easily. Business partners respected his composure. Friends who had once envied his marriage now admired his resilience. At night, he sat in his study, no longer listening for whispered phone calls or lies hidden behind laughter. The silence was a balm. He began journaling again, something he hadn't done since college. Page by page, he poured out his pain, his anger, his lessons. And slowly, those lessons began to shape him into someone stronger. Meanwhile, Rosemary's life unraveled piece by piece. Her ex had vanished, leaving no trace. The whispers in the jailhouse corridors said he'd fled across state lines, fearing the charges might catch up to him. She wrote him letters that came back unopened. She cried herself to sleep, her dreams haunted not by Joe's face, but by the dream house she would never step inside. The court of public opinion was harsher than any judge. Friends who once adored her refused to answer her calls. Neighbors who once complimented her fashion now spoke of her downfall in hushed tones. Even her own family distanced themselves, too ashamed to be tied to her scandal. Joe, however, refused to celebrate her suffering. He didn't post on social media, didn't gossip, didn't gloat. His silence spoke louder than any revenge ever could. And that silence cut her deeper than her prison cell. One evening, Joe visited his lawyer, Martin, who congratulated him on finalizing the divorce. As they shook hands, Martin asked, "Do you regret not confronting her the night you overheard her call?" Joe thought for a long moment before answering. "No. If I had confronted her then, she would have lied. I would have doubted myself, and the truth would have stayed buried. Patience gave me clarity, and clarity gave me peace." Martin smiled. "You're a different man now, Joe." Joe returned the smile faintly. "No, Martin. I'm just finally myself again." As autumn leaves began to fall across the city, Joe walked home with a quiet heart. For the first time in years, he wasn't walking toward someone else's dream. He was walking toward his own. And somewhere in a cold cell, Rosemary finally understood the price of greed. She had lost everything: her husband, her lover, her freedom, and most painfully, her dignity. Months passed, and the storm that once consumed Joe's life became a story whispered by others. The betrayal, the arrest, the divorce, they were no longer his burden. They were simply chapters in a book he had finished reading. Yet the lesson remained. On a quiet Saturday, Joe walked through the park, watching families play and couples stroll hand in hand. For the first time in years, he didn't feel envy or emptiness. He felt gratitude. Gratitude for surviving. Gratitude for seeing the truth. Gratitude for knowing he would never again confuse charm for love. Meanwhile, Rosemary sat in a stark prison library, flipping through worn-out pages of books she barely read. Every night, she replayed her downfall. The phone call Joe had overheard, the arrogance of believing she was smarter than him, the blind trust she put in an ex who abandoned her. The cruel irony was that the dream house she once schemed for still existed, built by another couple in another town. She had stalked the photos once, imagining herself on the porch. Now the only porch she knew was concrete, and her only view was barbed wire. Joe never visited. He never wrote. He didn't need to. His absence was louder than any confrontation. One evening, as Joe attended a community event, a young man approached him. "Sir, I heard what happened with your wife. Everyone talks about it. How did you get through something so painful?" Joe looked at him, then said words that would stay with the young man forever. "Betrayal is like fire. It burns, it scars, it can destroy. But if you survive it, you walk out knowing what truly matters and who you truly are. I didn't just lose a wife. I gained my freedom." The crowd applauded, but Joe didn't care for their approval. He cared only for the peace he carried now. Peace bought not by revenge, but by patience and truth. In her cell, Rosemary overheard other inmates gossiping about Joe, about his strength, about how he had risen above her betrayal. And in that moment, she realized the worst punishment wasn't prison. It was knowing that Joe had lived on without her. Stronger, freer, untouchable. As Joe closed his journal one night, he wrote the final line of his story. "When greed blinds the heart, betrayal will chain the hands. But truth will always set you free." And with that, he turned off the light, closed his eyes, and finally slept without fear. The chapter of betrayal was over. The chapter of freedom had just begun.